Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill, and we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word. Welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. You find us in the middle of a study about Peter, the life of Peter. The last words that we have from Peter in his letter encourage us to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Jesus Christ. And Peter, we are learning, has gained the right to tell us that because we get to watch him grow.
Yes.
And so we are learning lessons from him. On our last podcast, we learned the lesson about how Peter really learned that God cares for us and that you don't have to worry. You can cast it all on him. And so today we have another lesson that we watch Peter learn.
Yeah, today he's going to learn submission.
Ooh,
or
the S word.
To submit.
Yeah.
So kind of a sticky topic, but I think it's important to talk about because Peter talks about it and Peter learns it. Jesus teaches it. And so we're going to talk about that today.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we throw submission only to women for some reason. You know, we're all supposed to submit,
right.
and Peter has something to say about that.
Yeah, and I want to start with a quote. I really don't know where I pulled this quote from, but it said it's talking about how we live in this world, and it says how we live in this world matters. But to be free in Christ means we have a higher authority and we freely give respect and honor to all for Christ's sake. So really that's what we're talking about when we talk about submission, giving respect and honor, where we should give respect and honor.
Right.
So, and how we should give it. So I want to start in 1 Peter, Peter's writings to us. Mm-hmm. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13. And I'm going to go clear through chapter 3 because this whole section talks about submission. Peter writes about submission. So it says in chapter 2, verse 13, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God." Then I'm going to skip to chapter 3, verse 1. "Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear." So Peter addresses submission, but some interesting things here. He at the very beginning he talks about the king, and the king at the time, or the ruler at the time of this writing, was Nero, who was evil.
Yeah, we know lots of yucky stuff about Nero.
Yeah, so very evil king. So even in the midst of a bad ruler,
right,
he's telling them to submit to their ruling authorities. And then he's also, I want to point out, who is he talking to here? The first section, he's talking to citizens. If you are a citizen, you should submit to your government. The next section, he's talking about slaves, which in that time, slaves were little bit different. They could buy their freedom.
Yeah, I think it's not the typical slave we realize. I mean, they still, from what I've read, a lot of times you could see them walking down the street and you didn't know who the slave was and who the master was. They were part of the family. They could buy their freedom, and some of them chose not to because it was more profitable for them. So it didn't have quite the stigma that...
Right. And I read somewhere that they became a slave to pay off their debt. So instead of paying off their debt, they would become a slave to the master to help pay off that debt. So a little bit different context, but still, even if the master's harsh,
you still could have good masters and evil masters,
right,
I would think.
and you should submit to that authority. And then the last section is talking about wives. So these 3 sections are not talking about the leaders, how they should act. It's talking about the ones under the leaders, which is all of us at one point. We're all under some authority. So it's basically, how do we act toward our authority? And we all have authority, no matter what stage of life we're in, no matter where we are. So we all have authority. But one interesting thing that we learned in a Jen Wilkins study, I don't even remember which study it was, but I thought this was so good. So a lot of times in 1 Peter 3, when it says, wives, submit to your husband, it takes such a negative context and a negative way. But what she pointed out, or what I have taken from this passage, is women, you have power over men. And it's in your words, and it's in your body.
Yeah.
And those are the 2 ways you have power. Basically, don't use it against them. Because then later, it also says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner. And husbands, you have physical strength over your wife. Don't use it against her.
Yeah.
So really, he's specifically talking to women. Don't use your power against your husband. And then he talks to men. Men, don't use your power against your wives. So that to me is so much, I don't know, it's just a deeper thought in that word submission. People take it and, why do I can have my own thoughts. Why can't and I don't think he's talking about having your own thoughts and communicating with your husband and making decisions together and things like that. So
Right. Well, so, we started in 1st and 2nd Peter, and Peter lays that groundwork and says that we are to submit for the Lord's sake, what you read. Be subject in verse 13 of 1 Peter chapter 2. Be subject for the Lord's sake. And then he tells us, even the part that you skipped, is that because you've been called, because Christ also suffered and led you this example. Christ was this example of how to submit. He submitted to the authorities that, didn't understand that he really was God, and he didn't even say anything or call down 10,000 angels. So he was a perfect example of suffering under not authorities that ultimately killed him. So Peter had some chance to learn firsthand from Jesus. So I want to look at just a couple of times when we see Peter run into some authorities back in the gospel. And if you look in Matthew 17, in chapter 17, verse 24, says that they came to Capernaum, and the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went to Peter and says, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Now notice they go to Peter. So right off the bat, we know he's the leader. He's the spokesman. He's the person that they go to. And we see that time and again. So Peter was the person. And Peter says, yes, he does. So, they come and they say, does your teacher pay this tax? And Peter's like, yeah, he does. Then it says, when they got to the house, Jesus spoke to Peter first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do you think the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from other people? And when Peter said, from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them. Go to the sea, cast a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that, give it to them for me and for yourself. So he basically, it makes it sound like Jesus wasn't around, kind of, when these people come to Peter. But of course, Jesus knows what happens. And so Jesus finds Peter. And he kind of says, Peter, who has to pay the taxes? The sons of the king or the people? And basically he's saying, I'm a son of God. I don't have to pay this tax. But, and I love how Jesus says, but not to give offense. I think in the world today, we're talking about something that's not popular. We're talking about submitting and letting someone's have their will and not your will. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about willingly doing this, not when somebody is forcing you to, that's abuse. But we're talking when you choose to submit. And, Jesus says, in order not to give offense. I just think in so many times we live in a world where we get offended. Mm-hmm. And so we're offended by what someone said at church, or we're offended by what somebody said on social media. I mean, you just see that constantly. And Jesus says, in order not to give offense. And we know Jesus offended those Jews. They ended up killing him. But I want to be that way. I want to be someone who's hard to offend.
Right.
I don't want to be so prickly that I am catching everybody, well, you said this or that. I think that Jesus says, hey, when it's in your power, don't cause a stir. Just pay the tax.
Right.
Just give them the to whatever that was.
He does a miracle to pay that tax.
Yeah, he does.
It's that important.
Yeah, he says, let's just don't give offense. And then there's one other time where I think even gives us a little more insight in the same in the same book. If you turn over to Matthew 22, now we're talking about a tax that's paid to Caesar, which would be the Romans. And we know that it's a little bit harder to pay money to the Romans because they have been raising that and giving them grief. And this is not to the temple. But 22:15 says, the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. They're trying to get Jesus. And so they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and that you teach the way of God truthfully. And you don't care about anyone's opinion. You're not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is on this? They said, Caesar. Then he said to them, Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are things that are God's. And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. They couldn't catch him. He was smarter than them. But, this begs the question. Jesus tells them to bring a denarius and says, Whose inscription is on this? And they say, Caesar. And then he says, Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and give to God's what is God's. So the question is, well, what's God's? Well, what are God's? Well, if you think back, we are made in God's image. We bear the image of God. Just like that coin bore the image of Caesar, we are made in God's image, and we bear the image of God. So if you say you're a Christian, then you say you have died to yourself and you have been bought and you belong to Christ and his Spirit lives in you and you bear witness to that. And so give to God what is God's. Paul talks a little bit about this too in Romans. In Romans chapter 13, he tells the people to submit to the authorities of men. And he says, I'll flip over here so I can read this. And he says, submit to the authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those who exist have been instituted by God. And then down in verse 7, he says, pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. And honor to whom honor is owed. And we submit to others out of a submission to God. Mm-hmm. And I think that gives us the power to submit to others out of a submission to God. It's that battle again between the flesh and the spirit that we see so much in Romans. even though sometimes the people that we submit to, we sometimes feel like